John Wayne Gacy, a beloved Chicago contractor who dressed as Pogo the Clown, hid a dark secret. In the 1970s, young men began vanishing, leading police to uncover 33 victims buried beneath his home. This shocking discovery would redefine safety awareness and cement Gacy's place as one of America's most infamous killers. Today, we explore how one man deceived a community and the lasting impact of his crimes. If you're interested in more in-depth looks at cases like this, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to stay updated with our latest content. Let's dive in. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942 in Chicago, Illinois, to a working-class family. He was the second of 3 children in a strict household with a challenging home life. His father, John Stanley Gacy, was known for being physically and emotionally abusive, often targeting young John with harsh discipline and regular belittlement. Despite the harsh treatment, Gacy sought his father's approval throughout his life, trying to gain acceptance in any way he could. Growing up, Gacy experienced health problems, including a heart condition and several fainting spells, which often kept him from participating in typical childhood activities, further distancing him from his peers. This combination of factors, physical limitations, and a difficult home environment shaped much of his early life, creating a complex blend of isolation and a desire for acceptance. After high school, Gacy initially struggled to find his footing. He tried college briefly, but eventually dropped out and decided to move out of Chicago to seek new opportunities. By the mid-1960s, he found himself in Springfield, Illinois, working as a manager at a shoe company, a role where he discovered a knack for business. His natural charisma and strong work ethic made him popular with his colleagues, and he quickly rose to a management position, a trend that would follow him in future roles. It was also during this period that Gacy married his first wife and started a family. The two settled in Waterloo, Iowa, where he worked as a manager of a restaurant owned by his father-in-law. Gacy seemed to thrive in this new environment, integrating into the community and even joining local organizations, including the JCs, a national service club that focused on developing leadership skills. His time with the JCs was particularly significant. Gacy dedicated himself to community service, gaining a reputation for enthusiasm and leadership. However, during this time, darker aspects of Gacy's character emerged, leading to a conviction for sexual assault in 1968. After serving a brief prison sentence, Gacy returned to Illinois to rebuild his life. By the 1970s, Gacy had reinvented himself as a successful contractor in the Chicago area, founding his own construction company, PDM Contractors. This role allowed him to interact with people across the community, and he soon established himself as a respected businessman. Gacy's company took on a variety of projects, from remodeling homes to providing labor for larger construction jobs, and he frequently hired young men for these roles. His status within the community continued to grow, and he made connections with local leaders, politicians, and neighbors who viewed him as an upstanding member of society. Alongside his professional life, Gacy cultivated a unique public persona, Pogo the Clown. He designed his own clown costume, complete with bright colors and exaggerated makeup, and began performing as Pogo at local events, particularly for children's parties, community gatherings, and charity events. Gacy's clown act became popular, with the character appearing friendly and playful. Through Pogo, he seemed to embody a safe and cheerful presence in the community, further enhancing his image as a good-natured, involved citizen. This persona allowed him access to community spaces and events where he became well-known and well-liked, even earning him invitations to high-profile local gatherings and political events. Despite the darkness of his private life, Gacy continued to uphold this public image as a friendly neighbor, successful businessman, and a community figure with a passion for making others laugh. His role as Pogo the Clown became an integral part of how people knew him, allowing him to appear, at least on the surface, as an ordinary, even admirable, member of society. Throughout the mid to late 1970s, young men and teenage boys began to disappear from the Chicago area, with a disturbing pattern gradually emerging. These disappearances primarily involved males between the ages of 14 and 21, often last seen leaving their homes or jobs, sometimes with the stated intention of meeting someone for work or social plans. Many of these individuals came from various backgrounds and neighborhoods across Chicago and its suburbs, with few obvious connections to each other, making it difficult for investigators to link them initially. But as the number of missing persons reports increased, so did concerns, particularly from families who noticed eerie similarities in the stories of these young men's last movements. John Wayne Gacy became a common link in several of these cases due to his role as a contractor and local employer, often hiring young men to assist with his construction business, PDM contractors. Gacy regularly approached young men, typically offering them short-term labor jobs and promising them quick cash in exchange for help with projects. This employment tactic was effective, as many of his victims were seeking work, sometimes even struggling to find stable income. Gacy used his reputation as a respectable businessman to establish trust, often meeting these young men at local stores, bus stations, or social events. Through this combination of charm and opportunity, he could lure his victims with minimal suspicion, often picking those who were isolated or seeking financial support. One of the first individuals connected to Gacy was 16-year-old Timothy McCoy, who met Gacy at a Chicago bus terminal in 1972. Gacy offered him a place to stay for the night, positioning himself as a friendly local willing to help. McCoy's disappearance marked the start of a series of similar cases. Then came John Butkovich, an 18-year-old who worked for Gacy in his construction company. In 1975, Butkovich argued with Gacy over unpaid wages, but shortly after he disappeared with no immediate leads connecting him to Gacy. His car was found abandoned, but his family received no further information about his whereabouts. Although Butkovich's family reported him missing and consistently raised concerns, local authorities were unable to find any concrete evidence to link him to a crime or to Gacy directly. Over the next few years, more young men went missing under similar circumstances. Some, like 19-year-old William Carroll, were last seen accepting work offers, while others, such as 17-year-old John Zick, reportedly knew Gacy socially. Gacy maintained a calm, outward appearance, making it difficult for law enforcement to pin down any involvement. This pattern continued, with boys and young men from diverse backgrounds disappearing, often last seen with Gacy or in areas near his home or business. Most were either Chicago residents or suburban locals, and many were simply dismissed as runaways, due to their age and the tendency of authorities at the time to categorize teenage disappearances as voluntary. In December 1978, the case of 15-year-old Robert Piest took the ongoing disappearances to a turning point. Piest was last seen by his mother, who had come to pick him up from his part-time job at a local pharmacy. Before he left, he mentioned to his mother that he was going to speak to a contractor who had promised him a potential job opportunity. That contractor was John Wayne Gacy. When Piest failed to return home later that evening, his family quickly reported him missing. Unlike previous cases, Piest's family persistently pressured local police to investigate, and this push prompted officers to look further into his final known interactions. This relentless pursuit would lead law enforcement to reevaluate the larger pattern of missing young men and connect Piest's disappearance to Gacy in a way that they hadn't before. With little time wasted, the Des Plaines police began looking into Gacy, who was already known around the community and had a previous criminal record in Iowa. Initially, Gacy denied ever meeting Robert Piest, claiming he had no knowledge of him or any job offer. But detectives found Gacy's responses evasive, prompting them to delve further into his background. This scrutiny revealed that Gacy had served time in prison for a sexual assault charge years prior. Detectives began suspecting a connection between Gacy's criminal history and Robert Piest's disappearance, making him a person of interest. The police decided to place Gacy under surveillance, keeping a close eye on his movements. Detectives assigned to the case began tracking his activities, documenting his comings and goings, and watching for any unusual behavior. Meanwhile, they spoke with Gacy's employees and acquaintances, learning that he often offered young men quick, cash-paying jobs and that he was known to socialize with many of his young hires. Detectives also obtained statements from Gacy's former employees, some of whom described uncomfortable experiences working with him, reinforcing suspicions that Gacy might be connected to Piest's disappearance. During this time, the Des Plaines police applied for a search warrant for Gacy's home. While awaiting approval, officers continued their surveillance, even observing Gacy engaging in increasingly erratic behavior. At one point, he invited detectives following him into a restaurant where he commented on their persistence and seemed to challenge their presence. These interactions made detectives more determined to press forward. Finally, the search warrant was granted, allowing law enforcement to examine Gacy's property directly. When police entered Gacy's home for the initial search, they uncovered several items that heightened their suspicions. They found several personal items linked to young men reported missing, including driver's licenses, clothing, and jewelry that did not belong to Gacy. Notably, police recovered a photo receipt that matched one from Robert Peace's pharmacy. This discovery directly connected Peace to Gacy, reinforcing the urgency of the investigation. Despite these finds, investigators needed more evidence to make a concrete connection to any crime. Meanwhile, Gacy continued to act increasingly erratic, drawing more attention from the detectives surveilling him. Police intensified their search efforts, interviewing neighbors and employees who mentioned strange occurrences at Gacy's home, like late-night activity and rumors of an unusual odor coming from his crawl space. Combined with the discoveries of missing persons' belongings, these accounts created a strong case to secure a second, more thorough search warrant. On December 21, 1978, police returned to John Wayne Gacy's home with a second search warrant, this time allowing them to investigate the crawl space beneath his property. Based on mounting evidence from surveillance, interviews, and the earlier search of Gacy's home, investigators strongly suspected something far more sinister lay beneath the surface. As officers descended into the cramped crawl space, they were immediately struck by a foul odor in the compacted earth. This space, typically used for storage or utilities, had been repurposed by Gacy as a burial site for the victims who had mysteriously disappeared over the years. As investigators began to carefully dig into the crawl space, they made their first shocking discovery: human remains. The bodies had been buried in multiple layers, one on top of another, with each body arranged in ways that allowed Gacy to maximize the limited space. Some victims were only a few feet beneath the surface, and others were buried even deeper. The remains of victims lay in varying states of decomposition, with some bodies preserved enough to retain recognizable features, while others were barely identifiable. The forensic challenges were significant from the outset. Investigators had to proceed carefully to avoid disturbing evidence, taking meticulous care to document every body in detail. Due to the limited space, each recovery required precision, patience, and a strategic approach. Investigators used handheld tools to sift through the soil, trying to locate bodies without damaging bones or other potential evidence. The Chicago winter added to the complexity, as cold weather often affects decomposition, complicating the estimation of when each person had been buried. Forensic experts also faced the task of distinguishing individual remains in a space where bodies overlapped, some intertwined due to the manner of burial. This slow, painstaking work extended beyond the crawl space. Investigators found remains in other parts of Gacy's property as well, such as under the garage and near the home's foundation, forcing them to extend the scope of their search. They marked each site, noting the layout, and eventually removed the bodies with care to preserve as much forensic evidence as possible. Each new discovery added to the list of victims, creating a horrifying picture of just how many lives had been lost. As the bodies were uncovered, the news quickly spread, sending shockwaves throughout Chicago and the nation. Reports of the discovery of dozens of victims at a single residence were almost unbelievable, sparking intense public interest and media coverage. Neighbors who had long known Gacy as a friendly, well-liked figure in the community were horrified, grappling with the reality that someone they trusted had committed such horrific acts in their midst. Parents, families, and friends of missing young men anxiously awaited updates, many fearing the worst as authorities began the difficult task of identifying each set of remains. For many of the families involved, missing persons reports had already been filed long ago. However, during the 1970s, police often categorized missing teenage boys as runaways, which sometimes led to cases receiving less immediate attention. Some reports had been filed months or even years earlier, and in several instances, police initially assumed the teenagers had simply left home voluntarily. Now, with the discovery of multiple bodies on Gacy's property, law enforcement had to revisit each of these past cases, reopening files and cross-referencing them with the victims they were now recovering. The process of matching victims with missing persons reports was complicated by the lack of a centralized database for missing individuals, which required investigators to manually compare details. Some victims had no dental records or identifying markers, making identification a drawn-out process that relied on minor clues. Personal items recovered from Gacy's home, like jewelry, watches, or clothing, became critical pieces of evidence, allowing family members to tentatively identify their loved ones. However, this was a double-edged sword. While these items helped confirm some identities, they also caused further heartbreak for families, as each piece of personal property tied back to someone who had been taken. As identities were confirmed, families were officially notified of their loved ones' fates, marking the end of long periods of uncertainty. These confirmations devastated families and entire communities, with news reports of each identified victim bringing a new wave of grief. Local papers and national news outlets covered the story extensively, drawing attention to the family's loss and the magnitude of Gacy's crimes. Parents, siblings, and friends of the victims came forward to share memories of their lost loved ones, often describing them as kind-hearted, ambitious young men who had been on the brink of their futures before their lives were tragically cut short. The trial of John Wayne Gacy began on February 6, 1980 in Cook County, Illinois. This trial attracted intense public interest due to the shocking nature and sheer scale of his crimes. The proceedings focused on determining whether Gacy was legally responsible for the 33 murders he had been charged with, many of whom were found buried in the crawl space of his home. Given the horrific details of the case, the courtroom was packed daily with both journalists and members of the public, all awaiting each revelation. The prosecution presented a meticulously constructed case, calling numerous witnesses to testify against Gacy, including police officers, forensic specialists, and medical examiners who had been directly involved in the investigation and recovery of victims' bodies. These testimonies painted a clear picture of the brutal methods Gacy had used to lure, subdue, and ultimately murder his victims. Graphic evidence, such as photographs of the remains and details from the autopsies, underscored the cruelty of his actions, creating a deeply unsettling atmosphere in the courtroom. Medical examiners detailed the physical trauma found on each of the victims, including signs of strangulation and binding, establishing a pattern in Gacy's methods. A particularly compelling part of the prosecution's case was the testimony from surviving young men who had encountered Gacy and managed to escape. Their accounts corroborated the disturbing stories of manipulation, deception, and coercion that had led many others into Gacy's trap. These witnesses described how Gacy would lure them with job offers, quickly turning his demeanor from friendly to violent. These personal stories allowed the jury to hear firsthand about Gacy's manipulation tactics and violent tendencies, strengthening the prosecution's case by showing a consistent pattern of predatory behavior. In response, Gacy's defense team attempted to argue that he was legally insane at the time of the murders, claiming he suffered from multiple personality disorder and was therefore not fully responsible for his actions. The defense presented psychologists who testified that Gacy exhibited signs of severe mental disturbance, suggesting that he had different personalities who acted independently of each other, including the personality they claimed committed the murders. The defense's strategy relied on establishing that Gacy's mind was fragmented, with one of these personalities responsible for the violent acts, while others were unaware of the crimes. Despite these arguments, the prosecution countered by highlighting Gacy's calculated methods, pointing out that he had used deception to lure his victims and had gone to significant lengths to cover up his actions, including burying the bodies in his crawl space. This evidence suggested clear intent and awareness of wrongdoing, countering the defense's claim of insanity. The prosecution also brought in their own mental health experts who testified that while Gacy exhibited antisocial traits, he was fully aware of his actions and understood their moral and legal implications. Key moments in the trial included testimonies from law enforcement officers who described Gacy's behavior during their surveillance, his initial denials, and the eventual confession he gave in custody. Gacy's own words revealed a chilling lack of remorse, and his cavalier recounting of details only further solidified his guilt in the eyes of the jury. On March 12th, after weeks of harrowing testimony and evidence, The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, ultimately finding Gacy guilty of all 33 murders. His crime stood as one of the most extensive cases of serial murder in American history. The judge sentenced Gacy to death, a verdict that reflected both the calculated nature of his crimes and the overwhelming evidence of guilt. Gacy would later appeal the conviction multiple times, but his sentence was upheld. And in 1994, he was executed by lethal injection at the Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois. The trial and conviction of John Wayne Gacy served as a moment of closure for the families and communities affected, though the trauma and impact of his crimes would linger for years to come. This case highlighted the importance of vigilance in missing persons investigations and left a lasting mark on how the public and law enforcement approached cases of a similar nature in the years that followed. If you found this story insightful and want to see more content like this, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to stay updated. Your support helps us bring you more in-depth looks at cases like this one. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.